August 1917. The Eastern Front of World War I was frozen in anxious anticipation. The Russian Empire, torn apart by internal contradictions after the February Revolution, was barely holding the line of defense from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathians. In this tense geopolitical game, Riga held a special place. The largest port on the Baltic, an industrial center and a key transport hub connecting Petrograd with the western provinces. Control over this city provided a strategic advantage in the region and opened the way deep into Russian territory. The German command, realizing the weakening of the enemy, was preparing a decisive blow. The Russian 12th Army, exhausted by 3 years of fighting and corroded by revolutionary agitation, was preparing for defense. No one then assumed that the upcoming clash near the walls of the ancient Hanseatic city would not simply change the front line, but would become a turning point in the fate of all Eastern Europe, demonstrate new tactics of warfare, and accelerate the fall of a 300-year-old empire. Riga, the pearl of the Baltic coast, which for centuries attracted the attention of conquerors and traders. By the beginning of the 20th century, this city had become one of the largest industrial and transport hubs of the Russian Empire, the third most important port in the country after Petrograd and Odessa. Riga's geographical location made it Russia's gateway to Europe. Up to 20% of all Russian exports passed through the Riga port, including strategically important grain, timber, and metalworking products. Located at the mouth of the full-flowing western Dvina, Riga controlled a vital waterway connecting the inner provinces of the empire with the Baltic Sea. The railway junction connected the city with Petrograd, Warsaw, Libau, and other key centers. For the Russian Empire, Riga was not just an economic center. It was an outpost protecting the approaches to the capital. With the outbreak of the First World War, the strategic importance of the city increased many times over. After the loss of Poland and part of the Baltic states by 1915, Riga remained the only large Baltic port held by the Russian army in the western direction. The loss of the city would not only mean an economic blow, but would also open a direct road to Petrograd for the Germans. By the summer of 1917, a fortified area had formed around Riga, consisting of 3 lines of defense. The first ran along the western Dvina River, with bridgehead fortifications on the left bank. The second encompassed the city itself with a semi-ring of fortifications. The third line was located 20 to 30 kilometers east of Riga. The defense was held by the 12th Army of the Northern Front, stretched over a section of 120 kilometers. Its positions were particularly vulnerable in the area of the Ixchile bridgehead, where the river made a bend, creating a natural foothold for the attackers. The Russian command was aware of this danger, but did not have sufficient reserves to strengthen the defense. The German 8th Army, opposing the Russian troops, carefully studied the weaknesses in the enemy's defense. General Oskar von Hutier, commander of the 6th Reserve Corps, developed a plan for a swift strike across the Dvina, using new tactics of infiltration and concentrated artillery fire. By the end of August 1917, the scales clearly tipped in favor of the German army. The morale of the Russian troops fell every day. Soldiers' committees discussed political issues instead of combat missions. Officers lost authority. Chaos grew in the rear. The provisional government demanded that the city be held at all costs, but could not provide the front with the necessary reinforcements and supplies. In July 1917, there was a buzz of activity at the headquarters of the German command on the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff were poring over detailed maps of the Riga fortified area. The strategic situation for Germany was favorable. The revolutionary processes in Russia had weakened the enemy's combat capability, creating ideal conditions for a decisive blow. The operation was codenamed Zero Quote. Its development was entrusted to the talented tactician, commander of the 6th Reserve Corps, General Oskar von Hutier. It was this military leader who proposed a revolutionary concept of breakthrough for its time, which would later change the perception of offensive operations. Von Hutier's main idea was to abandon the traditional tactic of frontal assault with dense battle formations. Instead, it was proposed to use specially trained assault groups, which, after powerful but short artillery preparation, were to infiltrate the enemy's defenses at points of least resistance, bypassing fortified positions and attacking them from the flanks and rear. Ludendorff, appreciating the innovative approach, allocated significant forces for the operation. 8 infantry divisions, reinforced with heavy artillery and aviation. Special attention was paid to artillery support. Hundreds of guns of various calibers, including the newest 20-centimeter mortars and long-range cannons, were brought to Riga. German engineering units carried out colossal work to prepare the bridgehead. Under the strictest secrecy, they built pontoon bridges, disguised from aerial reconnaissance, and prepared dozens of crossing means for forcing the western Dvina. To ensure surprise, all troop movements were carried out exclusively at night. The intelligence department of the German staff meticulously studied not only the disposition of Russian troops, but also their morale. Agent reports confirmed the growing demoralization in the enemy's ranks, increased cases of desertion, insubordination to officers, fraternization with German soldiers. This information was taken into account when planning the operation. A key element of the plan was the choice of the direction of the main attack. Von Hutier proposed to launch it through the Ixkul bridgehead, the most vulnerable section of the Russian defense. Here, the river made a bend, forming a natural bridgehead, and the Russian positions were stretched and weakly fortified. The German command attached particular importance to the speed of the operation. Ludendorff insisted on a rapid development of the offensive after breaking through the first line of defense. For this purpose, mobile reserves were created, including cavalry units and bicycle battalions capable of quickly pursuing the retreating enemy. An important innovation was the use of the rolling barrage tactic, the sequential transfer of artillery fire into the depth of the enemy's defense directly in front of the advancing infantry. This technique, first applied on a large scale, allowed the offensive to be supported by fire, preventing the defenders from recovering and organizing resistance. By August 1917, the Russian army presented a sorry spectacle. The February Revolution, which overthrew the monarchy, delivered a crushing blow to the vertical of military command. The army organism, deprived of its customary chain of command, plunged into the chaos of self-governance and political discussions. The 12th Army, defending the Riga direction, suffered from the same ailments as the entire Russian front. Soldiers' committees, which emerged after the famous Order No. 1 of the Petrograd Soviet, effectively usurped control from the officers. Combat orders were now debated at meetings, where decisions were made by majority vote. Discipline crumbled before one's eyes. General Vladislav Klimbovsky, who assumed command of the Northern Front in July, reported with alarm to the provisional government. Units refused to occupy positions, considering them disadvantageous. Officers are subjected to insults and threats. Desertion has become widespread. In some regiments, no more than a third of the personnel remain. Agitators from various political parties moved freely between units, distributing leaflets and holding rallies. The Bolsheviks were particularly active with their slogan, "Down with the war." Their appeals found fertile ground among soldiers exhausted by 3 years of war. Fraternization with the enemy became common in quiet sectors of the front. Discipline problems were exacerbated by material difficulties. Army supply became increasingly irregular. There was a shortage of ammunition, food, and warm clothing. Soldiers grumbled, seeing officers receive better rations. In rear units, cases of looting and unauthorized requisitions from the local population became more frequent. Despite the general disintegration, pockets of order remained in the army. Individual regiments, especially those where officers managed to find common ground with soldiers' committees, maintained combat effectiveness. Artillery and engineering units, traditionally more disciplined, suffered less from revolutionary anarchy than the infantry. General Klembovsky, understanding the critical situation, tried to restore troop controllability. He personally toured positions, spoke with soldiers, and convinced committees of the need to maintain discipline. However, his efforts had only a temporary effect. The authority of the command was undermined by the very logic of revolutionary events. Intelligence reported German preparations for an offensive. But many soldiers refused to believe this, considering the alarming reports a provocation by officers who wished to restore the old order. When the command ordered the strengthening of defensive works on the Ixchile bridgehead, several companies defiantly refused to obey the order. An atmosphere of doom prevailed at the headquarters of the 12th Army. Officers understood that holding Riga with the troops in such a state would be practically impossible. Army Commander General Parsky wrote in a report to Klembovsky, "Most infantry units are uncombat ready. At the first serious enemy onslaught, a disorderly retreat should be expected." September 1st, 1917. The pre-dawn gloom still enveloped the banks of the western Dvina when the silence was shattered by the deafening roar of hundreds of guns. Operation Albion began, the German offensive on Riga, which was destined to enter military textbooks as a model of a new tactic for breaking through fortified positions. At 4:30 in the morning, over 200 guns of various calibers unleashed a barrage of fire on Russian positions in the area of the Ixchile bridgehead. The artillery preparation strikingly differed from the usual multi-day bombardments. Instead of methodically destroying the entire defensive line, the Germans concentrated fire on key points: command posts, artillery positions, and communication nodes. The shelling, which lasted only 4.5 hours, was extremely intense and precise. A novelty was the use of chemical shells with mustard gas and phosgene. Clouds of poisonous gas filled trenches and dugouts, forcing Russian soldiers to abandon cover under devastating shrapnel fire. There were not enough gas masks, and many were faulty. Communication between units was disrupted in the very first minutes of the shelling. At 9 in the morning, artillery fire suddenly shifted deep into the Russian defenses, forming a so-called fire barrage. Following this, specially trained German assault groups advanced to attack. Instead of traditional dense chains of attackers, small mobile detachments of 8 to 10 men armed with light machine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers moved towards the Russian positions. This tactic, later called infiltration, allowed German soldiers to seep through the weakened enemy defenses, avoiding frontal attacks on surviving pockets of resistance. Assault groups bypassed fortified points, attacked them from the flanks and rear, creating panic among the defenders. By noon on September 1st, advanced German units had already crossed the western Dvina. Engineering units built pontoon bridges in record time, across which the main forces were transported to the opposite bank. The Russian command, stunned by the speed of the German breakthrough, did not have time to transfer reserves to threatened areas. The second day of the offensive, September 2nd, was marked by the rapid expansion of the German bridgehead. General von Hutier skillfully used the tactic of wedges, concentrated strikes on narrow sections of the front, followed by the expansion of the breakthrough. To maintain the pace of the offensive, mobile units, cavalry and bicycle battalions were actively used, pursuing retreating Russian units, preventing them from consolidating on intermediate lines. Aviation played an important role in the success of the German offensive. Squadrons of the latest Albatros D-3 fighters and Gotha G-4 bombers established complete air superiority. They adjusted artillery fire, bombed columns of retreating troops, and destroyed bridges on the withdrawal routes of the Russian army. By the end of September 3, German troops had advanced 20 kilometers deep into the Russian defenses. The 12th Army was split into two parts. Its left flank was pushed north of Riga, and its right to the east. German motorized units rushed into the resulting gap, threatening the complete encirclement of the city's defenders. The Russian command, realizing the catastrophic nature of the situation, ordered a general retreat and evacuation of Riga. A disordered retreat began, often turning into a rout. Only individual units, primarily artillery and engineering, maintained organization and covered the withdrawal of the main forces. On September 3, 1917, it became clear Riga could not be held. General Parsky, commander of the 12th Army, having received reports of a deep German breakthrough, issued an order for the evacuation of the city and a retreat to new lines. This marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of the Eastern Front, a chaotic retreat of the Russian army, which turned into a veritable flight. The process of the city's evacuation was not prepared in advance, despite obvious signs of an impending German offensive. The army headquarters, paralyzed by conflicting instructions from Petrograd, hesitated until the last moment to begin the withdrawal of troops and valuable property. As a result, the evacuation became spontaneous. Military depots that could not be moved in time were set on fire. Black columns of smoke rose over the city, creating panic among the civilian population. Crowds of refugees streamed eastward, clogging roads and hindering the organized withdrawal of troops. Railway stations were overcrowded. People stormed the last trains heading towards Pskov and Petrograd. The retreat of troops occurred in three main directions. Units located north of Riga withdrew along the coast to Venden, modern Tsesis. The central grouping moved along the Pskov highway. The southern group, most vulnerable to German attacks, fought its way to the Wenden position through forests and swamps. It was in the southern direction that the situation was most critical. German mobile detachments, using cars and motorcycles, cut off retreat routes. Russian units were encircled, breaking out in small groups, abandoning heavy weapons and convoys. Many units completely lost control and scattered through the forests. General Parsky attempted to organize rearguard battles to contain the German offensive and gain time for the main forces to evacuate. For this task, the most combat-ready units were allocated: Siberian rifle regiments, separate artillery divisions, and engineering companies. These units, maintaining discipline, displayed genuine heroism, sacrificing themselves for the salvation of their comrades. Artillerymen distinguished themselves particularly. Remaining in their positions until the last possible moment, they fired upon advancing German columns, giving the infantry a chance to break away from pursuit. Many batteries were lost when crews, having fired all their shells, tried to move their guns along broken roads. In this critical situation, both the best and worst qualities of the Russian army manifested themselves. Alongside examples of self-sacrifice by officers and soldiers who fulfilled their duty to the end, there were cases of mass desertion and insubordination. Some regiments, especially those where revolutionary agitation was most successful, simply scattered at the first signs of danger of encirclement. On September 4th, German troops entered the deserted Riga. By this time, the main mass of Russian troops had already retreated beyond the River, Gauja, albeit in an extremely disorganized state. The losses were enormous, not so much in men, but in armament and military property. According to reports from the Northern Front headquarters, the 12th Army left the enemy about 300 guns, thousands of machine guns, tens of thousands of rifles, and huge stocks of ammunition and provisions. Human losses were also significant, up to 20,000 killed, wounded, and captured. However, the greatest damage was inflicted on the Army's morale. The chaotic retreat finally undermined the soldiers' faith in the command and Russia's ability to continue the war. In the units, there was open talk of the need for immediate peace, accusing officers and the provisional government of senselessly continuing the bloodshed. The defeat at Riga was a crushing blow to the prestige of the provisional government. Alexander Kerensky, who headed the cabinet of ministers, publicly accused the military command of treason. This accusation exacerbated the split between the country's political leadership and the army elite, which subsequently became one of the causes of the Kornilov affair. The news of Riga's fall struck Russia like a bolt from the blue. The provisional government, already balancing on the brink of political crisis, found itself under a barrage of criticism from all sides. Alexander Kerensky, who held the post of prime minister, immediately convened an emergency cabinet meeting. In an emotional speech, he placed responsibility for the defeat on the high military command, accusing the generals of sabotage and secret sympathy for monarchical ideas. These accusations, made publicly, only deepened the chasm between the government and the army leadership. In Petrograd, the news of Riga's surrender caused genuine panic. Rumors of an imminent German advance on the capital spread throughout the city. Thousands of people rushed to train stations trying to leave the city. Banks were besieged by depositors demanding their savings. The ruble exchange rate on the exchanges plummeted. Newspapers came out with screaming headlines: "Catastrophe at Riga! The road to Petrograd is open! Treason at Stavka!" Political parties reacted differently to the military defeat. Cadets and moderate socialists called for national unity in the face of an external threat. Right-wing forces used the situation to discredit the very idea of army democratization, arguing that revolutionary transformations had destroyed the combat effectiveness of the armed forces. The Bolsheviks, through the mouths of Lenin and Trotsky, declared that the fall of Riga was a direct consequence of the imperialist policies of the provisional government, which refused to conclude an immediate peace. At the front, the news of the defeat at Riga caused a wave of demoralization. Reports from the commissars of the provisional government spoke of mass desertions, refusals to carry out combat orders, and growing anti-war agitation. Soldiers' committees in many units adopted resolutions demanding immediate peace. Officers who tried to resist these sentiments were subjected to insults, and sometimes even physical violence. In this explosive atmosphere, an event occurred that further exacerbated the political crisis, the so-called Kornilov affair. Supreme Commander General Lavra Kornilov, shaken by the catastrophe at Riga and fearing a complete collapse of the front, demanded emergency powers from the provisional government to restore order in the army. Kerensky, seeing a threat to his power in these demands, declared Kornilov a rebel aiming to establish a military dictatorship. The connection between the Riga catastrophe and the Kornilov affair was direct and obvious. Many historians agree that it was the defeat at Riga that was the last straw, pushing Kornilov to decisive action. In his address to the people, he directly stated, Great Russia is dying. The enemy stands at the gates of the capital. One more effort, and collapse is inevitable. The failure of the Kornilov affair had catastrophic consequences for the remnants of state order. The army finally lost its unified command. Officers suspected of sympathizing with Kornilov were arrested or expelled from their units. Discipline completely collapsed. In essence, by October 1917, the Russian army as an organized fighting force ceased to exist. The provisional government, having won a Pyrrhic victory over Kornilov, found itself in a political vacuum. Kerensky lost support from both the right and the left. The right-wing forces could not forgive him for betraying Kornilov, and the left-wing forces could not forgive him for his inability to end the war and solve pressing social problems. The Bolsheviks, skillfully using the situation, rapidly increased their influence in the Soviets and army committees. The success of Operation Albion was a true revelation for the German military leadership. An atmosphere of triumph reigned at the Eastern Front headquarters. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg personally congratulated Oskar von Hutier on the brilliant execution of the operation. For the first time in many months of trench warfare, the possibility of rapidly breaking through fortified enemy defenses with minimal losses was demonstrated. The General Staff immediately began a detailed analysis of the Riga experience. Officers of the Operations Department meticulously studied every aspect of the operation, from preparatory measures to the tactics of small assault groups. Special attention was paid to innovative elements, short but intense artillery protection, the use of a creeping barrage, infiltration tactics, and the use of specialized assault units. By order of Erich Ludendorff, a special commission was created to generalize the experience of the Riga operation and develop a new tactical manual. General von Hutier himself, whose ideas were brilliantly confirmed in practice, led this work. By November 1917, the commission prepared a document called Manual for Breaking Through Positional Defenses. This work became a true Bible for German commanders of all levels in the last year of the war. The main principles of the new doctrine boiled down to several key provisions. First, the abandonment of lengthy artillery preparation in favor of a short but extremely intense fire strike using gas shells. Second, the use of specially trained assault groups equipped with light machine guns, flamethrowers, and grenades. Third, the tactic of infiltrating through enemy defenses by bypassing resistance strongpoints instead of frontal attacks. Fourth, the use of a creeping barrage for continuous support of advancing infantry. As Germany's position on the Western Front became increasingly critical, the Riga experience gained special value. Ludendorff, who took on the planning of the decisive offensive of the spring of 1918, made infiltration tactics the cornerstone of his strategy. The operation was codenamed, quote, and was intended to be Germany's last attempt to turn the tide of the war. To implement the new tactical approach, assault battalions, Sturmbataillone, began to be formed throughout the German army. These elite units were staffed by young, physically strong soldiers who underwent a special training course. The training program included hand-to-hand combat, grenade throwing, overcoming wire obstacles, interaction with flamethrower teams, and light artillery. Special attention was paid to developing the initiative of junior commanders, non-commissioned officers and sergeants, who had to make independent decisions in a rapidly changing combat environment. Parallel to the creation of assault units, artillery tactics were improved. The Riga experience showed the effectiveness of concentrated fire on key points of enemy defenses. Artillery officers developed new firing methods without preliminary sighting, based on precise ballistic calculations. This allowed for the achievement of surprise in the fire strike. a factor that played a decisive role in the Riga operation. In the spring of 1918, the new tactics were applied on a grand scale. On March 21st, 71 German divisions launched an offensive on the Western Front, using the methods developed at Riga. The initial success was stunning. In the first 2 days, German troops advanced 60 kilometers, breaking through a positional front that seemed impregnable. However, in the end, Operation Michael did not achieve its strategic goals. The Allies, already familiar with German infiltration tactics thanks to the analysis of the Riga events, managed to adapt and organize an effective defense in depth. In addition, limitations of the new doctrine emerged. Problems of supplying rapidly advancing troops, insufficient mechanization to exploit success, and the physical exhaustion of elite assault units, which could not be quickly replenished. The fall of Riga caused deep alarm among Russia's allies. In Paris and London, developments on the Eastern Front were closely watched, with the understanding that Russia's weakening would inevitably lead to the transfer of German divisions to the west. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, upon receiving a report on the city's surrender, convened an emergency meeting of the High Military Command. Marshal Foch, the future supreme commander of the Allied armies, grimly remarked, "Of particular interest to French military specialists were the tactical innovations demonstrated by the Germans near Riga." Colonel Henri Pétain, who at the time commanded an army group on the Western Front, tasked his staff with a detailed study of German infiltration tactics. French analysts quickly recognized the revolutionary nature of the new methods of warfare. Traditional positional defense, based on continuous lines of trenches, proved vulnerable to concentrated strikes by specially trained assault groups. The British command reacted to the Riga events with typical English coolness. General Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, ordered a group of military observers to be sent to Russia to gather first-hand information. These officers, who arrived at the headquarters of the Northern Front in late September, compiled a detailed report on the causes of the Russian army's defeat and the peculiarities of German offensive tactics. One of the first conclusions drawn by British experts was the recognition of the need to create an echeloned defense instead of concentrating the main forces on the front line. The experience of Riga showed that with a massive artillery strike, the first line of trenches would inevitably be destroyed or neutralized. Typically, the main defensive positions should be located in depth, out of reach of the initial artillery bombardment. French military theorists went even further in rethinking defensive doctrine. Colonel Louis de Grandmaison proposed the concept of elastic defense, which involved creating several defensive lines with intermediate strong points. Forward positions were to be occupied by only small groups of observers and machine gunners, while the main forces were located in depth, ready for counterattacks. The Allies paid particular attention to studying German artillery tactics. The short but exceptionally intense artillery preparation, using chemical shells and precise targeting of key objectives, made a strong impression on the Entente's artillery experts. French General Ernest Mercier, Chief Inspector of Artillery, initiated a program to improve counter-battery combat methods, including the development of new ways to locate enemy batteries and organize a massive fire strike on identified targets. By the beginning of 1918, the lessons of Riga had been largely assimilated by the Allied command. When the Grand German Offensive on the Western Front began on March 21st, employing on a massive scale the tactics refined at Riga, the Anglo-French forces proved better prepared than they would have been without this bitter experience. Although the Germans initially achieved significant successes, the offensive ultimately bogged down, encountering organized resistance in the depth of the Allied defenses. The fall of Riga became a catalyst for national liberation movements throughout the Baltics. For peoples who had lived for centuries under the rule of the Russian Empire, the retreat of the Russian army and the arrival of the generous created a unique historical moment, a power vacuum in which dreams of independence were born. Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, and Poles saw in these dramatic events a chance to create their own states. The Latvian national movement reacted to the fall of Riga ambiguously. On the one hand, the loss of Latvia's historical capital was a painful blow. On the other, the German occupation paradoxically strengthened the striving for independence. Latvian rifle units, formed as part of the Russian army, became the core of the future armed forces of independent Latvia. It was during these days that prominent Latvian politicians, including Karlis Ulmanis and Zigfrids Mairovics, began actively promoting the idea of autonomy and then full independence for Latvia. In Estonia, the news of Riga's fall caused alarm and simultaneously activated political processes. Estonian national leaders, realizing the threat of German occupation, accelerated efforts to establish the foundations of a future state. In September 1917, a meeting of representatives of all Estonian political parties was held in Reval, modern Tallinn, where a unified program of national autonomy was formed. The Lithuanian independence movement received a powerful impetus even earlier when German troops occupied most of the ethnic Lithuanian lands in 1915. However, it was precisely after the fall of Riga that Lithuanian politicians, active both in German-occupied Lithuania and in exile, intensified diplomatic efforts. Antanas Smetona, the future president of independent Lithuania, used the collapse of Russian defenses as an argument for Lithuanians to take their destiny into their own hands. The influence of the Riga events on the Polish national movement should be particularly noted. Poles, whose lands were divided between three empires, Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian, closely followed the developments on the Eastern Front. Józef Pilsudski, who led the Polish legions as part of the Austrian army, saw in Russia's defeat a chance to restore independent Poland. In his address to his comrades, he noted, "The colossus with feet of clay is beginning to crumble. Our task is to be ready to gather the fragments and build upon them the edifice of a free Poland." German occupation policy in the Baltics was contradictory. On the one hand, the Germans sought to integrate these territories into their economic system, viewing them as a source of resources and a potential zone of German influence after the war. They encouraged local self-government, but only within limits that did not threaten German interests. On the other hand, the occupying authorities could not completely ignore the national aspirations of the Baltic peoples, especially given the need to ensure the loyalty of the local population. In Latvia, the German administration relied on the Baltic Germans, descendants of medieval colonists, who had for centuries constituted the local elite. This caused discontent among ethnic Latvians, who saw in such a policy a return to feudal orders. At the same time, the Germans permitted the activities of the Latvian Provisional National Council, which became the prototype of the future government. In Estonia and Lithuania, the occupying authorities also balanced between direct rule and the granting of limited autonomy. This dual policy, aimed at ensuring stability in the rear with minimal resource expenditure, inadvertently contributed to the strengthening of national movements. Local political leaders gained invaluable experience in administrative work, which proved useful after gaining independence. The fall of Riga became a turning point in the history of Eastern Europe. It not only changed the military situation on the front, but also launched processes that led to the emergence of new independent states. When World War I ended in November 1918, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania appeared on the political map of Europe. countries whose path to independence began in those dramatic days when the Russian army abandoned the ancient city on the banks of the western Dvina. The sea, too, became an arena of confrontation in the battle for Riga. While dramatic events unfolded on land, a strategic struggle played out in the waters of the Gulf of Riga. The German command understood perfectly well that the success of the land operation largely depended on control over coastal waters and the neutralization of the Russian Baltic fleet. The Imperial German Navy allocated a special squadron under the command of Vice Admiral Erhard Schmidt to support Operation Albion. It included 2 König-class battleships, the cruisers Kolberg and Strasbourg, as well as a flotilla of destroyers and minesweepers. The tasks assigned to the naval forces were clearly defined: to block the Russian fleet in the eastern part of the Gulf of Riga, to ensure the security of the flank of the advancing ground troops, and to support them with naval artillery fire. The first step of the German squadron was to force the Elbe Strait, a narrow passage connecting the Baltic Sea with the Gulf of Riga. The Russian command had previously mined this section and installed coastal batteries on the Suvla Peninsula. However, by September of the 17th year, many guns had been removed to reinforce the land defense, and the minefields had been partially swept by German ships during previous operations. On September 2nd, when the land units had already broken through the Russian defenses, German minesweepers, under the cover of battleships, began clearing a passage through the minefields. Russian light forces, the destroyers Novik and Grom, attempted to impede this operation but were driven off by superior enemy fire. By the end of the day, German ships had entered the Gulf of Riga. On September 3rd, the battleship König and the cruiser Kolberg approached the coast near Riga and opened fire on the retreating Russian units. Heavy 14-inch shells destroyed bridges, railway junctions, and troop concentrations. The shelling of the Riga highway, along which retreating columns were moving, proved particularly effective. The Russian Baltic fleet, based in the Moonsund archipelago, found itself in a difficult position. The fleet commander, Vice Admiral Mikhail Bakirev, had several outdated battleships, cruisers, and a flotilla of destroyers at his disposal. However, revolutionary sentiments among the sailors seriously undermined the combat effectiveness of the ships. On many of them, power had practically shifted to ship committees, which often refused to obey officers' orders. Despite these difficulties, individual ships of the Baltic fleet showed high combat activity. The destroyers Novik and Zabiaka particularly distinguished themselves, maneuvering in shallow areas inaccessible to large German ships, striking enemy landing craft, and shelling its coastal communications. The events in the Gulf of Riga attracted close attention from naval experts of neutral countries, including Spain. The Spanish fleet, undergoing a period of modernization after the disaster of the Spanish-American War, carefully studied the experience of naval operations of the First World War. Of particular interest were actions in coastal waters and the interaction of the fleet with ground forces. In Madrid, reports from the naval attaché in Petrograd, Captain First Rank Fernando Carranza, were eagerly awaited. His detailed reports on the actions of the opposing fleets in the Gulf of Riga landed on the desk of the Minister of Marine, Admiral Augusto Miranda. Spanish specialists were particularly interested in several aspects of the operation. Firstly, the effective use of minesweepers by the Grandas for rapid clearing of minefields. The Spanish fleet, realizing the vulnerability of its coast to a possible blockade, began a program of building its own minesweepers, using German experience. Secondly, Spanish analysts were impressed by the accuracy of German battleship fire on coastal targets. In his report, Captain Carranza noted, "German artillerymen demonstrate astonishing accuracy when firing from a pitching platform at moving targets on shore. This is the result not only of excellent optical instruments, but also of a carefully developed fire correction system using aircraft and ground observers. Thirdly, the Spanish were interested in the tactics of using light forces, destroyers and torpedo boats, for operations in shallow areas. The Spanish fleet, limited in resources for building large ships, considered the possibility of creating a numerous fleet of light forces to protect its coast. The battle for Riga in the autumn of 1917 left a deep mark not only in military history, but also in the geopolitical landscape of the entire 20th century. This operation, lasting only a few days, changed the course of the First World War on the Eastern Front and initiated processes whose echoes we feel to this day. The historical significance of these events goes far beyond the tactical success of the German army or Russia's strategic defeat. The Riga operation became a true laboratory of military art, where concepts that shaped the face of armed conflicts for decades to come were refined. The infiltration tactics employed by General von Hutier found their continuation not only in subsequent operations of the First World War, but also in the blitzkrieg strategy of the Second World War. German tank wedges, cleaving through enemy defenses in 1939 and 40, followed the same logic as the assault groups near Riga. A concentrated strike, a deep breakthrough, bypassing resistance nodes. Even modern concepts of warfare using high-precision weapons and special forces have their predecessors in those September days of 1917. The geopolitical consequences of the battle for Riga proved no less significant. The defeat of the Russian army accelerated the collapse of the provisional government and the Bolsheviks' rise to power. The October Revolution, the Civil War in Russia, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, all these are links in a single chain, the beginning of which was laid on the banks of the western Dvina. The fall of Riga became a catalyst for national liberation movements in the Baltics and Poland. The independence of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and the revival of the Polish state. These fundamental changes in the political map of Eastern Europe would have been impossible, or would have taken on a completely different character without those dramatic events. The post-war arrangement of the Baltic region, formed as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, is directly linked to the outcome of the Riga operation. The creation of the so-called sanitary cordon of small states separating Soviet Russia from Germany became possible thanks to the impetus received by national movements after the retreat of the Russian army. This geopolitical construct, though short-lived, defined the appearance of the region for 2 decades and laid the foundation for subsequent conflicts. The lessons of the battle for Riga remain relevant for modern military strategists. The most important of these is the need to adapt to rapidly changing combat conditions. The Russian command, constrained by outdated doctrines and internal contradictions, proved incapable of resisting the enemy's innovative tactics. This lesson was dearly paid for in 1917 and unfortunately was repeatedly confirmed in subsequent conflicts. Another important lesson concerns the interrelationship between internal political stability and the combat capability of the armed forces. The revolutionary processes in Russia, which destroyed the vertical of military administration, made defeat almost inevitable. This pattern manifested itself repeatedly in the history of the 20th century, from the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the collapse of colonial powers after the Second World War. For modern international relations in the Baltic region, the legacy of the Riga operation is of particular importance. Historical memory of those events still influences the perception of threats, the formation of alliances, and the defense policies of the Baltic states. The fear of a repeat of the 1917 scenario, the loss of independence as a result of military defeat, remains an important factor in the political consciousness of these states. Ultimately, the battle for Riga reminds us of the fragility of geopolitical constructs and the unpredictability of historical processes. A local military clash, lasting only a few days, launched a chain of events that changed the face of an entire continent. This lesson is especially relevant today, when the world is once again experiencing a period of turbulence and reassessment of established notions of international security.